A journey interrupted. The crisp autumn night had an almost magical quality to it, a gentle reminder of the season's transition. Carol James stepped out of St. Mary's Baptist Church, feeling the warmth of fellowship and the lingering harmony of hymns. She was a well-respected figure in her community, known for her quiet strength and her unwavering dedication to both her faith and her career. Tonight, as she left the church, her heart was light, and her mind drifted between memories of the evening and thoughts of the comforting chamomile tea waiting for her at home. "Good night, Sister Carol," called Pastor Richards, waving from the steps of the church. His words were full of warmth and reverence, recognizing Carol as a steadfast member of the church community. "Good night, Pastor," Carol replied, her silver bracelet catching the light as she waved back. She had worn that bracelet, a gift from her late mother, for years. It was a reminder of her family, her roots, and the journey she had undertaken to arrive where she was, a dedicated FBI agent, a role she kept discreet, especially within her close-knit community. Carol climbed into her dark green SUV, settling into the familiar leather seat. She adjusted her mirrors, checked the time, 8:45 p.m., and whispered a small prayer of thanks for a peaceful night. The town was quiet, with most families at home after a night of trick-or-treating. The streets were empty save for a few stray leaves skittering along the sidewalk under the glow of the streetlights. As she drove along the winding road that led to her home, Carol's mind was a mixture of work and rest. There was a case looming over her, one that she knew would take more than just skill to unravel. But for tonight, she wanted to set it aside and focus on the simple comforts of home. The calm was shattered when she noticed headlights flashing erratically in her rearview mirror. A red sedan was swerving dangerously, crossing lines, and closing in fast. Carol's training kicked in instantly. She adjusted her grip on the wheel, veering slightly to the right to give the other car space. But before she could fully move out of harm's way, the sedan swerved sharply toward her. In an instant, metal collided with metal, a brutal, deafening crunch that shattered the night's stillness. Carol's SUV spun out of control, skidding across the road as the force of the impact sent her lurching forward. Her seatbelt held her back, but the sudden jolt sent sharp, radiating pain through her left shoulder. Her head struck the window, and everything became a blur. When the world stopped spinning, Carol realized her hands were locked in a death grip on the steering wheel, her knuckles pale and trembling. Her forehead stung, and she felt something warm trickling down, a thin stream of blood from a cut just above her eyebrow. She looked in the rearview mirror and saw the red sedan had stopped several yards away, resting against a guardrail, its front crumpled like a discarded soda can. She watched as a figure stumbled out of the driver's seat, seemingly unharmed but dazed. Carol's mind raced, and she instinctively felt for her badge in her pocket, a source of comfort and authority. Struggling through the pain, Carol knew she couldn't stay on the road, especially not at night, and in such a vulnerable state. Her training reminded her of the nearest safe location, the highway patrol station she had passed a few minutes earlier. Ignoring the throbbing in her shoulder and the sting from her forehead, she started the SUV, tested the gas pedal, and felt a wave of relief as the vehicle moved forward, albeit with a pull to the left. Carol whispered another prayer, "Lord, guide me." Her hands trembled as she drove, her mind sharp with determination but clouded by the persistent pain. She kept glancing in the rearview mirror, but the driver of the red sedan hadn't followed her. As she maneuvered her damaged vehicle, her thoughts turned to her father's words. "If you're ever in trouble, go to the authorities. That's what they're there for." With renewed focus, Carol guided her SUV toward the distant lights of the highway patrol station. The drive felt longer than it was, each second punctuated by the dull ache in her shoulder and the sting of the blood that had dried on her forehead. When the station's bright lights finally appeared, it was as though a weight lifted from her heart. As she parked in front of the station, her composure began to crack. The trauma of the accident, the fear of the unknown, and the physical pain pressed down on her all at once. But she quickly reminded herself that she was stronger than this. She had faced worse dangers and emerged intact. She took a deep breath, steadied her hands, and stepped out of the SUV. Inside the station, a young officer noticed Carol immediately and rushed out. "Ma'am, please sit down. We'll get you help right away," he said with a reassuring yet professional tone. His partner, a more experienced officer, immediately called for an ambulance, concern etched on his face as he took in the state of Carol's vehicle. "What happened, ma'am?" the young officer asked, taking out a notepad as Carol leaned against the side of her SUV, her breath coming in short, controlled gasps. Carol recounted the details with remarkable clarity, despite the shock. "A red sedan. It came out of nowhere, swerving. It hit me on the side, and my SUV spun. The driver got out, looked unhurt. I just drove here. It seemed the safest place to go." The older officer nodded, his gaze serious. "We'll take care of everything, ma'am. Just sit tight. The ambulance is on its way." Carol felt a sudden urge to reveal her identity, to pull out her badge and make it clear that she wasn't just any citizen. But something held her back. She had always prided herself on facing situations as herself, as Carol, not just an FBI agent. The badge was part of her identity, yes, but tonight, she wanted to be treated just like anyone else who had survived a car crash. Moments later, the familiar sound of sirens filled the air, and an ambulance pulled into the station's parking lot, its red and white lights casting a surreal glow on the scene. Carol exhaled, a mixture of relief and wariness washing over her. She had made it to safety, and now she could finally let go and allow herself to be cared for. The paramedics approached, their hands gentle yet efficient, as they began their initial examination. "You're a lucky woman," one of them remarked, his voice full of admiration as he took in the severity of the damage to her SUV. "This could have been so much worse." Carol offered a weary smile. "God was watching over me," she replied softly, her voice filled with gratitude. As the paramedics prepared to lift her onto the stretcher, she glanced back at the patrol officers, offering a nod of appreciation. She may have been the one in need tonight, but she knew that her own strength, both inner and outer, would carry her through. As she settled onto the stretcher, she prepared herself for whatever lay ahead, knowing that this incident, while painful, was just another chapter in her story of resilience and courage, confronting bias and pain. The ambulance ride to the hospital felt both fleeting and eternal. The paramedics worked with precision, tending to Carol's wounds and monitoring her vital signs. As the stretcher wheeled through the emergency room's bright lights and antiseptic-smelling halls, Carol closed her eyes, letting the exhaustion settle into her bones. The night had taken a toll on her body, but her mind remained clear, turning over the events and questions about the driver of the red sedan who had so recklessly upended her evening. Carol was placed in a curtained-off section of the emergency room, where a nurse quickly set to work cleaning the cut on her forehead and wrapping her shoulder. As she lay on the stiff hospital bed, the bright fluorescent lights revealed every detail of the cramped, slightly chaotic emergency department. Around her, the muted voices of nurses and doctors faded into a hum of background noise. Carol tried to relax, but the room's starkness and her unresolved pain kept her alert. After several minutes, the curtain was pulled back abruptly. A tall, stern-looking doctor with graying hair and a slight frown entered. He barely glanced at her, more interested in the chart than in the person lying in front of him. His face held a look of impatience, as if Carol's presence was an inconvenience. Carol's heart sank slightly, her instincts sensing something was amiss. Without looking directly at her, the doctor muttered, "So, car accident, minor head laceration, and a possible shoulder injury. I'll see if I have time for an X-ray later tonight." Carol furrowed her brow. "An X-ray would be helpful. My shoulder's been hurting badly since the impact," she replied, maintaining her usual polite tone, despite the doctor's dismissive attitude. He shrugged, barely looking up from the chart. I'm quite busy tonight. We're short-staffed, and we have more critical cases to attend to." The response stung more than Carol anticipated. She knew emergency rooms were often overwhelmed, but there was a coldness in his manner that felt directed personally. Taking a deep breath, she tried to let it go. She had always been someone who faced adversity with patience and resilience, but the doctor's attitude only added to her discomfort. Time ticked by slowly. Nurses walked past, busy with other patients, and Carol's mind drifted to the life she had built. She thought of her years of service, the countless hours dedicated to her work, and the sacrifices she had made. All of it had come with a sense of pride and purpose. Yet here she was, vulnerable and in need, and feeling distinctly overlooked. After what felt like an eternity, the doctor returned. His expression was still one of impatience, and he barely acknowledged Carol as he placed a stethoscope against her back, listening to her breathing for a few seconds before pulling it away. "Your lungs sound fine. I'll prescribe some pain medication, and you should follow up with your primary care physician if the pain doesn't subside in a week or so," he said curtly. Carol's patience was wearing thin. "Doctor, an X-ray would be best to rule out any serious injury," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I'd rather not leave without knowing if there's something more severe with my shoulder." The doctor sighed, rolling his eyes slightly as he placed her chart down with an audible thud. "Look, I understand you want an X-ray, but I have patients with real emergencies to handle. Not everyone here has all night to wait." The implication in his words was clear and painful. Carol's heart sank. She had seen this treatment before. People dismissed because of assumptions based on the color of their skin or their perceived importance. She had spent years as an FBI agent, fighting for justice and equality. But tonight, here in this hospital, she felt the sting of discrimination on a personal level. Carol took a deep breath, steadying herself. This wasn't the time to let emotions dictate her response. She had spent her career carefully choosing her words, and she wouldn't stop now. "Doctor, I appreciate your busy schedule, but I am a patient in need of appropriate care. It is my right to have a thorough examination after a car accident." The doctor's face turned red, not from empathy, but from indignation. "Listen, you're not the only one here. We're doing the best we can with what we have," he said tersely, clearly dismissive. Carol's hand drifted to her pocket, where her badge rested, hidden but reassuring. She had chosen not to pull it out, feeling it wasn't necessary to assert her authority in a simple hospital setting. But now, the weight of the situation pressed on her, and she felt that it was time to remind him that she was more than just a patient in a waiting room. With calm and composure, she withdrew the badge and held it up, her voice steady and unwavering. "Doctor, I am Special Agent Carol James with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I'm here because I was involved in a serious accident, and I expect the same standard of care you would provide to any patient, regardless of your assumptions about them." The doctor's face went from red to pale in seconds. His eyes widened, and he took a step back, his earlier impatience replaced by a look of shock and discomfort. I didn't realize." "No, you didn't realize," Carol interrupted, her tone calm but resolute. "And that's exactly the problem. You made an assumption based on who you thought I was, but my occupation doesn't change the fact that I'm a human being deserving of respect and adequate medical care." The doctor fumbled with the chart, his hands visibly shaking. I'll order that X-ray right away, Agent James, and I apologize if I gave the wrong impression." Carol watched him with a mixture of disappointment and resolve. She didn't enjoy pulling rank or using her badge to influence others, but tonight it felt necessary. Her mind drifted back to all the other patients who may not have had the means or the courage to demand the respect they deserved. This wasn't just about her. It was about standing up for everyone who had ever felt unseen or dismissed. True to his word, the doctor returned shortly with an apology and a much more attentive demeanor. He ordered the X-ray, and a nurse arrived minutes later to wheel her down the hall. The X-ray confirmed what Carol had suspected: a minor fracture in her shoulder, one that would have gone unnoticed without proper examination. As she was wheeled back into her room, Carol felt a deep sense of relief, not just from knowing the extent of her injury, but from having asserted herself in a moment that felt degrading. She was not just a patient, and she was not just an FBI agent. She was a woman who had spent her life fighting for justice and fairness. And tonight, she had fought for her own. When she was settled back into her bed, the same doctor approached her, visibly humbled. He spoke with a softer, more respectful tone as he went over her treatment plan, explaining that she would need to wear a sling and rest for several weeks to allow the shoulder to heal properly. Carol listened politely, though her thoughts were already beyond the hospital walls, considering the broader implications of what had just happened. Before leaving, the doctor looked down at her with a trace of genuine remorse. "Agent James, I truly am sorry for how I acted earlier. I realize now that I was hasty and unfair." Carol nodded, accepting his apology with grace. "Thank you, doctor, and I hope in the future that every patient you see receives the respect they deserve, regardless of who they are." As he walked away, Carol felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had always known that her work went beyond her office walls. Her influence, her voice, her actions, all of them were a part of a larger effort to make the world a more just and equal place. Lying in that hospital bed, Carol realized that her role as an agent wasn't just about enforcing laws. It was about challenging injustices wherever she encountered them. Tonight had been a reminder of why she had chosen this path in the first place. She closed her eyes, allowing herself a moment of peace, knowing that she would continue to stand firm against discrimination, both in her professional life and her personal one. Reflections and revelations. The following day dawned with a soft, gray light that seeped through the blinds of Carol's hospital room. She blinked, letting her eyes adjust to the dim glow and feeling the ache in her shoulder pulse beneath the protective sling. Last night's events felt surreal, almost as though they were fragments of a bad dream. But as Carol looked around the sterile hospital room, she was grounded in the reality of the situation. The dismissal, the confrontation, the X-ray, it had all happened, and it had left her with a mixture of frustration, resolve, and a determination that burned beneath the surface. A light knock at the door pulled Carol from her thoughts. She looked up to see a young nurse, her face framed by wisps of curly brown hair escaping from under her cap. Her warm, empathetic smile was a stark contrast to the doctor's cold indifference from the previous night. "Good morning, Ms. James. I'm Nurse Emily," she said brightly, stepping in with a small tray. "I've brought you some breakfast, and I'll need to check your vitals, if that's all right." Carol nodded, grateful for the kindness. "Thank you, Emily," she replied, shifting slightly to make room. Emily adjusted Carol's pillows and laid the tray on her lap. As she wrapped the blood pressure cuff around Carol's arm, she began to chat softly, a comforting presence amid the lingering haze of pain and exhaustion. "Looks like you've had quite a night. Car accidents can be so traumatic," she said sympathetically, giving Carol a reassuring smile as she jotted down her blood pressure reading. "You're lucky your injuries weren't worse." Carol managed a small nod. Yes, it was unexpected, to say the least. Her voice was calm, but her mind was busy processing the memories of last night. Not just the accident, but the underlying biases she had felt in that brief but sharp interaction with the doctor. Emily noticed the thoughtful look on Carol's face and offered a gentle touch on her good shoulder. "If you need anything, just call. I'm here all morning." "Thank you, Emily," Carol replied, watching the nurse leave the room with a newfound sense of gratitude. Emily's warmth and professionalism were a stark reminder that not everyone in healthcare was dismissive or biased. There were good people, compassionate people who treated everyone with the respect they deserved. But last night's experience lingered like a dark cloud, a reminder of a reality she had faced time and again. As she nibbled on her toast, Carol's thoughts drifted back to her early years in law enforcement. She remembered her training, the relentless push to be tougher, stronger, faster. She had faced more obstacles than most, especially as a black woman in a field that was still grappling with issues of diversity and inclusion. Even with her excellent track record and high clearance, she'd encountered more than her share of assumptions and judgments. But she had chosen to rise above, letting her work speak for itself. This was more than just about her experience. It was about those who hadn't been able to stand up for themselves, who had been silenced by circumstances beyond their control. Her mother's words came back to her now, spoken in their small living room so many years ago. "Carol, never forget where you came from, and never let anyone define who you are. You're here to make a difference." Just as she was lost in thought, the door opened, and she looked up to see a familiar face. Detective Mark Evans, a longtime friend and colleague who had been in the department for nearly as long as Carol. With his broad shoulders and kind eyes, Mark was a reassuring presence, and Carol couldn't help but feel a wave of relief. "Carol," Mark greeted, his voice full of concern as he approached her bedside. "I heard what happened. Are you all right?" Carol managed a smile, gesturing to her shoulder. "Just a minor fracture. It could have been worse." Mark nodded, pulling up a chair beside her bed. "When I heard about the accident, I couldn't believe it. And then, when I got the call this morning from one of our units who found the driver of the other car, I knew I had to come see you myself." Carol's eyebrows rose in surprise. "They found him?" "Yes. Turns out he wasn't just some random drunk driver. His name is Kevin Dawson, and he's wanted for a series of thefts and assaults across state lines. He's been a slippery one, and we've had him on our radar for months." Carol's eyes widened in realization. The accident hadn't been a simple incident with an irresponsible driver. She had been hit by a fugitive, someone who had put others in danger before. Her instincts had been right. There was more to the story. "Dawson is in custody now," Mark continued, leaning in with a serious expression. "But here's the thing, Carol. He claimed he recognized you." "Recognized me?" Carol's mind raced. She rarely made her identity as an FBI agent public, especially not in local cases. Her face wouldn't be familiar to just anyone. But her career had brought her into contact with dangerous individuals, some of whom had made threats over the years. "Yes, he mentioned he knew you were with the Bureau, and he thought if he could scare you off the road." Mark's voice trailed off, his expression grim. Carol felt a chill run down her spine. Dawson's reckless actions weren't just a result of inebriation or negligence. He had intentionally sought to harm her, to intimidate her, hoping to prevent her from continuing her work. But he hadn't anticipated her resilience, nor her determination to see justice served. Mark reached out, placing a hand on her good shoulder. "Carol, you've done so much for this community and for the Bureau, but I need you to know, we're all here for you. This incident, no matter how personal it feels, is something we'll handle together." Carol took a deep breath, steadying herself. She had faced danger before, but this was different. The collision, the hospital, the doctor's indifference, all of it had been wrapped in a subtle yet persistent reminder of her role in a world that sometimes failed to see her value beyond stereotypes and expectations. "Thank you, Mark," she said quietly, her voice tinged with gratitude and determination. "I've always known that this job would come with challenges. But what happened last night? It's more than just another incident. It's a reminder that there's still work to do, both on the streets and in places like this hospital." Mark nodded, his expression reflecting a deep understanding. "You've been a pioneer, Carol. You've shown countless others that they belong in this field. But I think this experience could be a way for you to make an even bigger impact. People need to see the truth about bias and discrimination, not just in law enforcement, but in every corner of our society." Carol absorbed his words, feeling a new sense of purpose ignite within her. This wasn't just her battle. It was a call to action. She thought of the countless individuals who faced similar treatment, not just in hospitals, but in workplaces, schools, and every other facet of life. Her voice, her story could serve as a beacon for change, a way to confront not just criminals but the invisible barriers that still plagued society. As Mark rose to leave, He offered her a reassuring smile. "Take care of yourself, Carol. And remember, you're never alone in this fight. We've got your back." After he left, Carol lay back on her pillow, letting his words resonate. The fatigue was setting in, but her mind was sharper than ever. She knew what she had to do, not only for herself, but for those who couldn't stand up in the same way. Her injury would heal, but the scar of last night's experience would remain, serving as a reminder of her commitment to justice in all its forms. As she closed her eyes, she felt a new sense of clarity. She would use her voice, her platform, and her story to bring awareness to the injustices others experienced silently, and in doing so, she would ensure that her pain served a purpose, transforming it into a catalyst for positive change. Taking a stand, Carol was discharged from the hospital a few days later, with her arm in a sling and a renewed determination burning in her heart. The experience had left her physically bruised but emotionally fortified. The thought of the doctor's dismissive treatment, compounded by learning that Kevin Dawson had targeted her intentionally, kept replaying in her mind. She felt the weight of the situation like never before. This was personal and systemic all at once, a reminder of how much work still lay ahead. Back at home, her small, cozy living room seemed to welcome her with open arms, grounding her in the familiarity of her space. Framed photos of family members, awards she had earned over her career, and shelves filled with books on law and justice surrounded her. Each memento served as a testament to her journey and her resilience. Sitting down carefully, she let out a sigh, resting her head back against the cushions, feeling the warmth and comfort of her space. But she knew rest alone wouldn't bring the change she wanted to see. A knock at her front door jolted her from her thoughts. She eased herself up and opened the door to see Sarah Fields, a journalist friend who had been following Carol's career for years. Sarah was a fierce advocate for social justice, a tireless reporter who believed in using her platform to spotlight systemic issues and give voice to those who were often unheard. "Carol, I'm so glad to see you're home," Sarah said, her tone gentle but filled with purpose. She held up a notebook and recorder, her eyes scanning Carol with both concern and admiration. "I know this isn't exactly the best time, but I'd like to talk to you about what happened at the hospital. I think your story could have an impact." Carol smiled, inviting Sarah in. "I was actually hoping you'd stop by. There's a lot to unpack, and I want people to know what I went through. Not just for me, but for everyone who's been treated unfairly in a similar situation." They settled into the living room, and Carol recounted her experience with careful precision, not just the details of the car accident or the ensuing pain, but more importantly, the treatment she had received in the emergency room. Sarah listened intently, her pen moving rapidly across the notepad as she documented every word. "Carol, you've always been resilient," Sarah said once Carol had finished. "But this story isn't just about resilience. It's about fighting back against systemic biases. What do you hope comes from sharing this experience?" Carol looked thoughtfully out the window, her gaze fixed on the colorful autumn leaves fluttering in the breeze. "I want people to understand that bias isn't just a problem in policing or government. It's in our healthcare, our education systems, our workplaces, and unless people speak up, these issues continue unchecked. I hope this story will empower others to stand up and demand the treatment they deserve." Sarah nodded, her expression one of shared conviction. "I'm going to do everything I can to make sure your voice is heard. But there's more we could do, Carol. What if this story becomes the starting point for something bigger?" Carol felt a spark of inspiration ignite within her. She had always believed in taking direct action, but Sarah's words opened up a new possibility. "Are you thinking of organizing something?" Sarah leaned forward, her eyes bright with excitement. "What if we held a town forum, inviting people to share their experiences with bias and discrimination? You could speak, and we could bring in community leaders, local activists, and even healthcare providers. If we bring enough voices together, we could push for real changes in the way our local institutions operate." Carol felt her pulse quicken. The idea resonated deeply. "A public forum," she murmured, the vision forming in her mind. It could be an opportunity for healing, awareness, and action. Not just for me, but for others who need to be heard. They spent the next few hours strategizing, planning the forum's logistics, and identifying the key figures they would invite to participate. Carol suggested reaching out to local medical practitioners, teachers, and civil rights activists, anyone who could shed light on the pervasive issues of discrimination within their fields. They also planned to invite individuals to anonymously share their own stories, giving a voice to those who might feel too vulnerable to speak out publicly. By the time Sarah left, the plan was in motion. Carol felt a renewed sense of purpose and strength. This forum would be her way of channeling the frustration and disappointment she had experienced, transforming it into something powerful and constructive. In the days leading up to the event, the community buzzed with anticipation. News of the forum spread quickly, with people sharing the event on social media and discussing it in town halls and community centers. Local leaders voiced their support, recognizing the forum as an opportunity to address long-standing issues that had been simmering beneath the surface. On the evening of the event, Carol arrived early at the town hall. The large room was set up with rows of chairs, a small stage at the front, and a podium adorned with a microphone. Sarah and a few other volunteers were arranging the final touches, placing stacks of note cards and pens on a table by the entrance so attendees could write down their experiences if they preferred not to speak openly. As people began to file in, Carol felt a familiar sense of anticipation. It was the same feeling she got before a big case, that mixture of excitement and gravity that came with knowing that something meaningful was about to unfold. The room filled quickly, every chair taken, and a few latecomers standing along the back wall. Carol took a deep breath, looking out over the crowd. She recognized familiar faces, friends, neighbors, colleagues, as well as many she didn't know. There were young people and elderly residents, people from all backgrounds, united by a shared desire to create a better, fairer community. When the time came to begin, Sarah stepped up to the podium to welcome everyone. Her voice carried through the room, calm and clear. Thank you all for coming tonight. This forum is a chance for us to address issues that too often go unspoken, to hear stories that are too often unheard. And we're here tonight because we believe in building a community where everyone is treated with respect, dignity, and fairness. She introduced Carol, who stood up slowly, making her way to the front of the room. Her shoulder throbbed, a reminder of the ordeal she had endured, but her spirit was unbreakable. As she looked out over the crowd, she saw the anticipation in their eyes, the silent support they offered just by being present. "Thank you, Sarah," Carol began, her voice strong but tempered with emotion. "I'm here tonight to share my story, not just for myself, but for everyone who has felt dismissed, overlooked, or treated unfairly. This isn't just about a single experience. It's about a pattern, a culture that needs to change." She recounted the events of that night, from the car accident to the hospital visit and the interaction with the doctor. Her words were met with nods, murmurs, and quiet expressions of empathy. As she spoke, Carol felt the weight of her experience lift, replaced by a feeling of solidarity. She could see her story resonating with others in the room, each of them carrying their own invisible burdens. When she finished, there was a heavy silence before the first round of applause broke out, filling the room with a wave of support and encouragement. Carol felt a swell of emotion as she looked out over the audience, grateful to have found her voice in a way that others could share. Throughout the evening, one by one, people came forward to share their own stories. A young mother recounted a painful encounter with a school administrator who had dismissed her concerns about her child's learning difficulties. A man described the discrimination he had faced in a job interview, despite his years of experience. A retired teacher spoke about the bias she had witnessed in classrooms and how it had affected countless students. The forum became a space of collective healing, a place where people could release their pain and find a renewed sense of purpose. By the end of the night, Carol felt the power of the community, unified in their determination to make a difference. She knew that this was only the beginning, a stepping stone toward broader changes. As the crowd began to disperse, Sarah approached Carol, her eyes shining with admiration. "You did it, Carol. This was more than I could have hoped for. You're inspiring people to believe in change." Carol nodded, feeling the truth of Sarah's words settle in her heart. She wasn't just an agent of the law. She was an agent of change, someone who could lead others toward a fairer, more just world. And tonight, she had taken the first step in a journey she was ready to see through to the end. The path to change. In the days following the town forum, the atmosphere in the community shifted. Conversations sparked by the event rippled outward, reaching schools, workplaces, and homes. People discussed not only the stories they had heard, but the systemic issues those stories highlighted. Carol had ignited a spark, and now she saw it grow, feeding on a newfound commitment to change. The local news picked up on the forum, with articles and interviews featuring Carol's story as a catalyst for the community's renewed interest in tackling bias and discrimination. Seeing her story in print, Carol felt the weight of responsibility. She knew that the road ahead would be challenging, but the success of the forum had shown her that real change was possible. The event had been a first step, but Carol was determined to keep pushing forward. She sat at her kitchen table one evening, her left arm still in a sling, reviewing a list of names and ideas she'd jotted down after the forum. She had decided to form a community coalition, a group dedicated to identifying and addressing instances of bias across all sectors. From healthcare and law enforcement to schools and businesses, she wanted to create a framework for identifying, tracking, and addressing inequity. As she considered her options, her phone buzzed, breaking her concentration. She picked it up and saw a message from Sarah, who had become both a close friend and an invaluable partner in her efforts. "Hey Carol, just heard from the local hospital. They want to have a meeting about reviewing their patient treatment policies. I think your story may have reached some higher-ups. Let me know if you'd be interested in attending." Carol's heart lifted at the news. The hospital, the very place where she had faced dismissal and indifference, was taking her story seriously. If they were willing to review their policies, there was potential for genuine change. She replied with a quick, affirmative response, then leaned back, feeling the surge of optimism. Carol realized this was the type of impact she had envisioned, not just bringing awareness to problems, but creating real, actionable solutions. The following week, Carol and Sarah arrived at the hospital's administrative office. A polished, modern space, it was worlds apart from the bustling emergency room she'd been wheeled into just weeks before. The receptionist led them to a conference room where a handful of hospital administrators waited. Among them was Dr. Blake, the physician who had treated her so dismissively. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair when Carol entered, offering a tentative smile that barely masked his discomfort. The head of the hospital, Dr. Simmons, welcomed them warmly. He was a tall, dignified man with a compassionate expression that conveyed both authority and empathy. "Ms. James, Ms. Fields, thank you both for joining us," he began, his tone respectful. "We've been discussing ways to improve our approach to patient care, and your recent experience highlighted areas where we have room for improvement." Carol glanced at Dr. Blake, who looked down at the table. She knew he had been forced to confront his biases, just as she had been forced to confront the pain of being treated as less than. But her goal wasn't to shame him. It was to ensure that no one else faced the same treatment. "We're very grateful for the opportunity to discuss this," Carol replied. "I believe that everyone deserves fair and compassionate treatment, especially in a place as vital as a hospital." Dr. Simmons nodded, his expression thoughtful. "We've reviewed your experience, and we recognize that we fell short. We've already begun developing new training sessions for our staff, focused on empathy, cultural awareness, and the importance of treating all patients with respect, regardless of background. But we'd like your input. Your perspective is invaluable in helping us identify blind spots we may not be seeing." Carol felt a rush of gratitude. This was exactly what she had hoped for, a commitment to improvement, and a genuine openness to change. "Thank you, Dr. Simmons," I'd be glad to help. I'd also like to propose a regular feedback system for patients where they can anonymously report any concerns about the quality of their treatment. Dr. Blake finally spoke up, his voice hesitant. Ms. James, I want to personally apologize for how I treated you. There's no excuse. I didn't realize how deeply ingrained my own assumptions were. I promised to do better. Carol looked at him for a long moment, reading the sincerity in his expression. She knew that change wasn't easy, especially when it required examining one's own flaws. Thank you, Dr. Blake. Admitting that is a step in the right direction. I appreciate your willingness to grow. The meeting continued, with Carol and Sarah contributing ideas and discussing methods for ongoing accountability. By the time they left, Carol felt hopeful. She knew that the hospital's efforts were just the beginning, but it was a beginning she could stand behind. Over the next few months, Carol poured herself into her coalition work. She hosted monthly meetings where community members shared experiences and identified areas that needed reform. She reached out to local government officials, advocating for policy changes that would address disparities in healthcare, education, and criminal justice. Each step forward was a small victory, building on the momentum she had created that night at the forum. One evening, Carol found herself at her dining room table, a stack of notes in front of her, preparing for the next coalition meeting. Her shoulder had healed, and her physical strength was returning, but she knew the emotional toll of her journey would take longer to fade. Just as she finished organizing her materials, her doorbell rang. She opened the door to see a familiar face. Detective Mark Evans, the friend and colleague who had stood by her side since the accident. "Hey, Carol," Mark greeted, smiling warmly. "I thought I'd check in. I heard you've been making waves in the community." Carol chuckled, motioning for him to come in. More like ripples, but it's progress. They sat together in her living room, and Mark shared updates on Dawson's case. The investigation had revealed more than expected. Dawson had been involved in a larger network of theft and assault, and the information Carol's case had provided had helped bring others to justice. But after updating her on the case, Mark turned to her, his expression more personal. "Carol, I want you to know that what you're doing here, it's not going unnoticed," he said, his tone filled with pride. "I've seen the impact you're having. People are talking about it, and they're inspired. Your voice is changing things." Carol looked down, a slight blush coloring her cheeks. "I'm just doing what I can." Mark shook his head. "No, it's more than that. It takes courage to confront these issues head-on, especially when they're so ingrained in our society. You're standing up for people who don't have the power to speak for themselves. That's more than doing what you can. That's leadership." Hearing those words from Mark, a man she deeply respected, touched Carol. For so long, she had seen her work as an agent, as her primary contribution to society, her way of making a difference. But now, she was starting to understand that her impact extended beyond her role in law enforcement. By speaking out, by challenging norms, and by creating opportunities for others to be heard, she was leading a movement that would have lasting effects. As they sat in companionable silence, Carol felt a quiet sense of pride. Her journey hadn't been easy, and there were still battles to be fought. But she knew she was on the right path. The next day, as she prepared for the coalition meeting, she looked over her notes, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The community was ready for change, and she was ready to lead them. And as she walked into the meeting hall that evening, greeted by a room full of supporters and allies, she knew that together they would continue to push for the justice and equality they all deserved. The ripple effect. Months had passed since Carol had started her coalition, and the seeds of change were visibly taking root in her community. Her coalition, once a small group of concerned citizens, had grown into a formidable organization with chapters in neighboring towns. Community members from all walks of life joined their ranks: students, educators, healthcare workers, law enforcement officers, and local business owners, each united by the shared belief that together They could challenge and dismantle the invisible barriers that perpetuated inequality. Carol felt both proud and humbled by the way the community had responded. What had started as her personal experience had become a platform for dozens, then hundreds of others to share their own stories and make their voices heard. But this growth also brought new responsibilities, and Carol was keenly aware of the careful balance she needed to maintain to keep the coalition focused, impactful, and inclusive. One evening, Carol found herself at the town hall again, this time to address an even larger audience. The coalition had organized a public meeting with city officials to discuss the implementation of new policies in schools, hospitals, and other public institutions to ensure unbiased treatment for everyone. The event was not just another forum. It was a landmark moment, one where the community could hold leaders accountable and outline clear steps for change. As Carol entered the hall, she was greeted by a wave of applause. People from every corner of the community had come to show their support, and Carol was touched by the unity and strength that filled the room. Sarah was there, sitting in the front row with a camera, ready to document the night. Detective Mark Evans stood nearby, representing the local police department and vowing to continue his support of the coalition's efforts. Carol took her place at the podium, looking out at the diverse faces before her. She cleared her throat, gathering her thoughts, and began to speak. Thank you all for being here tonight. It's both an honor and a privilege to stand before you. When I first shared my experience at the hospital, I never imagined it would lead to this movement. I spoke out because I knew I couldn't stay silent about an injustice that I felt deeply, but I quickly realized that this wasn't just about me. It's about all of us and the world we want to create, a world where everyone is seen, respected, and treated fairly. The crowd listened intently, their faces a mixture of encouragement and determination. Carol continued, her voice steady but filled with passion. Our goal tonight is to talk about real change, concrete steps that will ensure fair treatment in our schools, hospitals, businesses, and police stations. We have stories, we have evidence, and we have a community willing to push for what's right. But it takes all of us working together to make it happen. She outlined the coalition's proposals, which included mandatory bias and empathy training for public employees, regular community forums, and an anonymous reporting system for incidents of discrimination. She presented data that had been gathered from the community, stories that highlighted the need for these changes. Each statistic and anecdote reinforced the reality of the issues they faced. When she finished, she invited others to speak. One by one, individuals from different backgrounds stepped forward to share their own experiences and insights. A local teacher spoke about the subtle biases that affected children in classrooms, from discipline policies to academic expectations. A doctor recounted the challenges of addressing patient complaints about bias and how he, too, had felt the system wasn't equipped to handle these issues. A young woman who had faced discrimination in her workplace shared her story with tears in her eyes, but a sense of empowerment she had never felt before. Finally, Mayor Johnson took the podium. He was a tall, distinguished man known for his pragmatism, but tonight his tone was different, more compassionate, more vulnerable. Thank you, Carol, and thank you to everyone here, he began, his voice steady but thoughtful. I've listened to each of you tonight, and I recognize that we have a long road ahead. Change won't happen overnight, but I am committed to working with this coalition and with every single one of you to build a community that honors and respects all of its members. The mayor went on to announce a task force dedicated to enacting the coalition's recommendations. He pledged city resources to support the training and feedback initiatives Carol's team had proposed. For the first time, it felt as though the local government was not just listening but genuinely taking action. After the speeches concluded, people gathered in small groups, discussing their plans, sharing contact information, and volunteering to help with the coalition's initiatives. Carol moved through the crowd, greeting people and listening to their feedback. Each conversation reinforced the sense of purpose that had driven her since that fateful night. When the event finally wound down, Sarah pulled Carol aside, her face glowing with excitement. "Carol, you did it," she said, her voice barely containing her admiration. "This is everything we dreamed of and more. Look at how many people are here, ready to work for a better future. You inspired them." Carol smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you, Sarah. You were the one who believed this could be something bigger. You saw the vision before I even realized what it was." They embraced, each of them aware that they had created something far greater than either of them had anticipated. It was a movement, a coalition of individuals united by a common goal, with the power to create lasting, systemic change. Over the following months, the coalition's influence continued to grow. They hosted workshops, community events, and open forums, each one a reminder of the strength of unity and the power of resilience. They collaborated with schools to improve cultural awareness among educators, implemented training programs in the local police department, and began hosting monthly health equity seminars at the hospital. Each victory, no matter how small, felt monumental, and each step forward strengthened Carol's resolve. The local news outlets followed their progress, often interviewing Carol as the face of the coalition. Her story became a beacon of hope and inspiration, encouraging others in nearby towns to form their own coalitions and address the injustices in their communities. She received letters of gratitude from people she had never met, each one expressing how her story had inspired them to speak up, to stand up, and to believe in the possibility of a better world. One afternoon, as Carol sat at her desk, reflecting on all they had achieved, she received a letter that brought tears to her eyes. It was from a young woman who had attended the initial town forum. The letter read, "Dear Ms. James, I'm writing to thank you for giving me the courage to believe in myself and my voice. I was there that night when you spoke at the town hall, and something in me shifted. I realized that I didn't have to accept being treated poorly, that I didn't have to stay silent about the things I see happening around me. Since that night, I've been working to make changes in my own life and my own community. I joined my university's social justice committee, and we're starting a chapter inspired by your coalition. Thank you for showing me that one voice can create a ripple that changes the lives of so many. You've given me hope, and I know I'm not alone in that." Carol set the letter down, her heart full. She had always believed in justice, but now she understood that justice was not just about enforcing laws. It was about building bridges, lifting others up, and creating spaces where everyone could thrive. The coalition had become more than she ever dreamed it could be, and it was no longer about her own experience. It was about everyone who had come forward, everyone who had found strength in their shared stories, and everyone who believed in a better future. As she sat there, Carol knew that her journey was far from over. She would continue leading, continue fighting, and continue building. The movement had grown beyond her, but she would remain at its heart, guiding it with the same determination and resilience that had carried her through that fateful night in the hospital. Carol looked out the window, feeling the warm glow of the afternoon sun on her face. She had transformed her pain into purpose, and in doing so, she had built something enduring, something that would stand long after she was gone. And in that moment, she knew with certainty that she had found her life's true calling, not just as an agent of the law, but as an agent of change. Legacy in motion. Several years had passed since Carol James founded the coalition, and the impact of her work had spread far beyond her local community. What began as a grassroots movement had grown into a nationwide organization, with chapters across the country tackling bias and discrimination in healthcare, education, criminal justice, and more. Carol's coalition, now known as the Equity Alliance, had become a symbol of justice, resilience, and the power of unified voices to drive systemic change. Carol herself had evolved, becoming a nationally recognized figure in the fight for equity. She was invited to speak at universities, government forums, and even international conferences, sharing her story and encouraging others to create their own paths to justice. Yet, despite the accolades and the widespread influence of her work, Carol remained grounded. To her, each speech, each forum, And each new chapter of the alliance was a reminder of her personal mission, a mission that had started not with ambition, but with pain and a deep-seated belief in the dignity of every individual. One fall morning, Carol sat in her office, a spacious but modest room adorned with awards, letters from supporters, and photographs of coalition members from different cities. She had recently returned from a conference where she'd spoken on the importance of empathy in healthcare, and she was planning a local meeting for the following weekend. As she reviewed her notes, her assistant, Maya, knocked gently on the door. "Carol, there's someone here who wants to speak with you. She says she's from your hometown, and she specifically requested to meet you." Carol looked up, curious. While she often met with individuals from around the country, few came from her hometown. She closed her notebook and stood, brushing off her slacks and adjusting her blazer. "Sure, Maya. Please show her in." Maya returned a few moments later with a young woman in her early 20s. She had a nervous yet determined look about her, her eyes bright with a mixture of awe and respect. She wore a simple dress and held a worn notebook in her hands, clutching it as though it held something precious. "Hello, Miss James," the young woman said, her voice slightly shaky. I'm sorry if this is unexpected, but I needed to meet you. My name is Leela Brooks. I'm from Eastwood, the same town you're from." Carol smiled warmly, gesturing for her to sit. "It's so nice to meet you, Leela. Please, make yourself comfortable." Leela sat, her grip on her notebook easing as she relaxed slightly. "I've heard your story my whole life, Ms. James. My family always talked about you and how you inspired the town. I wanted to tell you something, if you don't mind." "Of course. I'm here to listen," Carol replied, her tone encouraging. Leela took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. "My mother was there the night you spoke at the town forum. She told me about how you stood up and shared your story, how you spoke about the bias you experienced, and how it wasn't just about you, but about all of us. My mother has since passed, but she always said that night changed her. She realized she didn't have to stay silent when things felt wrong." Carol felt a warmth spread through her, her heart swelling with both sadness and pride. "Thank you for sharing that, Leela. Your mother sounds like an amazing woman. I'm honored that my story could have that kind of impact." Leela nodded, her face softening with emotion. "She was amazing, and her story inspired me too. I wanted you to know that because of her, and because of you, I became the first person in my family to go to college. I'm studying social work, and I hope to bring the same kind of change to other communities, just like you did." Carol felt a lump form in her throat. Here, sitting across from her, was the embodiment of the ripple effect she had once dreamed of creating. This young woman was part of the next generation, carrying forward the values that Carol had worked so hard to instill. "Leela, that's incredible," Carol said, her voice filled with genuine admiration. "The fact that you're taking what your mother learned and making it a part of your own life is the most powerful legacy anyone could hope for. Your journey is exactly what I envisioned when I started this work." Leela's eyes shone with gratitude. She opened her notebook, flipping through pages filled with notes and sketches. "I've been taking notes and documenting my ideas," she explained, showing Carol her plans for community outreach programs and workshops she hoped to create. "I thought maybe I could work with the Equity Alliance someday." Carol's face broke into a smile. "I think you're exactly the kind of leader we need, Leela. And when you're ready, we'll find a place for you here. But remember, your path doesn't have to follow anyone else's. You have the power to create your own vision, your own way of helping others. If you need mentorship, I'm here for you, but I want you to feel free to create what feels right for you." Leela nodded, her expression resolute. "Thank you, Ms. James. I promise I'll work hard, and I'll make you proud." As Leela stood to leave, Carol walked her to the door, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. Seeing the impact of her work reflected in Leela's aspirations reminded her of why she had started this journey. She watched as Leela walked down the hall, the young woman's confidence radiating with each step. Carol returned to her desk, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Over the following weeks, Carol continued her work with the Equity Alliance, expanding their outreach and increasing their influence. Each day brought new challenges, but she faced them with the same resilience that had carried her through her journey so far. And as Leela began volunteering with the organization, Carol found herself mentoring the young woman, guiding her through the complexities of advocacy and helping her build the foundation for her own legacy. One crisp winter evening, Carol was invited to receive a Lifetime Achievement Award at a National Civil Rights Gala in Washington, D.C. The event was a prestigious affair, attended by activists, politicians, and advocates from across the country. As she stood on the stage, receiving the award to thunderous applause, she felt the weight of every step she had taken to reach this moment. When the applause quieted, Carol took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts before addressing the audience. "Thank you for this incredible honor," she began, her voice carrying through the large hall. "But I want to say that this work has never been about recognition or accolades. It's been about people, real people, who deserve fairness, justice, and respect. It's been about individuals who, in the face of indifference, have chosen to stand up and demand change. And I want each of you to know that this award isn't just for me. It's for everyone who has ever spoken out, who has ever refused to accept injustice, who has ever fought for the dignity of another." The audience listened, their expressions a mixture of admiration and gratitude. Carol continued, her gaze moving over the sea of faces before her. "I accept this award not just for myself, but for the countless voices who have lifted me up along the way. For the mothers, fathers, children, and friends who have each played a role in making this world a better place. Our work isn't over. There are still battles to fight, still stories to hear, still lives to uplift. And as long as there is injustice, I promise you that I will keep fighting." The audience rose in applause, the sound reverberating through the hall as Carol looked out over the crowd, her heart full. She saw Leela in the audience, clapping with tears in her eyes, alongside Sarah, Mark, and others who had supported her journey from the beginning. In that moment, Carol realized that she had not only built a coalition, but had created a legacy, a living, breathing testament to resilience, justice, and the power of unwavering belief in equality. As Carol stepped down from the stage, a sense of peace washed over her. She had transformed her pain into purpose, and that purpose had created a legacy that would continue long after she was gone. Her story, her journey, her fight for justice, all of it would live on in the people she had inspired, in the community she had touched, and in the lives that would be forever changed by the work she had done. That night, as she returned to her hotel room and looked out over the city lights, Carol knew her journey was far from over. But she also knew she had left an indelible mark on the world, a mark that would continue to grow, ripple by ripple, through every person she had empowered to believe in a world where justice and compassion prevailed. And as she closed her eyes, she felt the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived, a purpose fulfilled, and a legacy in motion.